Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of our card game mechanics series. In this one, we are going to be talking about the 7 sources within the Atnia card game, which, why don't you start us off with what these sources are doing?
Yeah, so sources are essentially a system of gating what type of cards you can play together, which is really common in these sort of deck building card games. So if you're familiar with Hearthstone, for example, there are several classes that you can choose when you build your deck, and some cards are available to all classes, whereas other cards are only available to a specific class. So you can only sort of play those specific sets of cards together with the one hero power that comes with it. This is our sort of answer to this question of how do you make sure that decks end up being diverse and you don't just play all the best cards in the game in one single deck. Sources, unlike Hearthstone, aren't a hard restriction. You can play basically any 2 cards in the game in the same deck. But what sources are is they're sort of an additional cost in addition to the energy you spend that make it more difficult to play certain types of powerful cards in the same deck, or sort of serve as an additional cost for the extremely powerful cards in the game.
Yeah, so the exact way in which I've implemented the sort of gating of cards is has a bit of a different philosophy to these hard gates, but we'll get into that later. For now, let's talk about the 7 sources that you're able to play within the game, because these are kind of the main thematic categorizations of cards. So why don't you start us off with Zeller?
Zelor is a source that's all rooted in stories and emotion. So each of these sources is kind of a collection of vibes and like things that people in the world might draw their power from. So a card that has Zelor for a source might be something deeply emotional or rooted in storytelling or legends or something like that. Burning rage or love for a friend or something like that is kind of the power source that makes up Zelor.
And Zeller cards are generally going to be sort of having these kind of themes and visuals, and they're going to mechanically be represented by, they have some of the better removal in terms of being able to directly damage your opponent's cards when they are on the board. Other sources are able to directly damage cards in other contexts, but Zeller is kind of the best at directly damaging cards that are already played onto the board. And they're also able to directly damage your opponent. So that's kind of Zeller's main way of interacting. And in terms of what cards they're going to have in set 1, it is mostly likely going to be a mix of aggressive units, sort of a spells theme. It's going to have some stuff to do with knights and nightmares, as well as maybe a little bit of warriors that are going to be sort of using weapons to strike your opponent and their units. So because Zeller is going to be one of the sources that is able to use its interaction more proactively, its solo theme for set 1 is to increase the potency of its direct damage cards.
Moving on to the next major source, we have Arca. Atnia is currently flooded with this unpredictable magical energy, and that's kind of what Arca represents, is it is the chaos, unpredictability, and power associated with the new world, the apocalypse, this great green rift in the sky, flooding magic into the world. It is the source of zombies, abominations, but also of growth and sort of new magical abilities out of nowhere.
Yes, and mechanically, Arca is also able to do direct damage, but it is more able to do direct damage to cards that are currently being played. So you kind of have to deal damage to your opponent's cards right away after they play them. Otherwise, you're kind of left the window to be able to damage them. And it also is able to deal damage to your opponent, but to a lesser degree than Zeller. Arca also has a very heavy spells focus, because it is sort of built around this kind of rift magic. And the rift magic is going to be rather different from the Zeller magic in terms of how it is going to look visually, as well as to some extent how it plays mechanically, because it is going to be less about maybe your knights attacking and stuff, and more about sort of the raw magical potential of your spells themselves, and maybe also some stuff to do with even more heavily into the sort of nightmares theme and clerics, where you're going to be using this kind of magic that is sort of creative and destructive at the same time, where you're going to be maybe drawing cards, discarding your cards from the board. Maybe your clerics are going to be involved in that. You'll be bringing back your nightmares. And that's kind of like the whole vibe of Arca for set 1.
Yeah, and over time, I think Arc is going to have sort of a lot of powerful and tricksy effects, maybe be able to cheat on some costs by paying other costs, that kind of thing. So moving on to the next source, we have Ecclesia, which is based on sort of faith and religion. If you're granted a boon by the gods or wielding a magical relic left behind by them, or just fighting based on your true beliefs, or like sort of the clerics and priests of the world, that's going to follow under the source of Ecclesia.
Yep, and Ecclesia is mechanically the way it is able to interact with your opponent's cards is going to be through these relics. They'll be under the item card type, which is going to involve your item getting rid of your opponent's thing, perhaps only temporarily until they're able to deal with your magical relic. But that is basically how Ecclesia is going to be able to stop your opponent's game plan. Ecclesia on its own is very heavily into the clerics theme in set 1. It's going to be all about clerics and the item card type, and a little bit of bring things back from the dead to some extent. Part of what Ecclesia is going to be doing is sacrificing your relics to create power as well. Ecclesia's final theme for set 1 is built around using high source devotion cards and high energy cost cards. So you're going to be making these big plays in one way or another. You're going to have different ways of getting these big plays onto the board, and this is going to be something that you can hope to do within Ecclesia.
And sort of the vibe around this is the powers of the gods being this like really extreme thing that is almost lost to this world, and so like calling upon these great powers that sort of barely exist. And then the next source after that, we have Eminus, which is kind of a power source based around your reputation or laws, and sort of power based on almost your belief in the power itself, like your trust in other people and things like that. It's kind of the source of choice of arbiters, the law mages in the world, as well as diplomats and politicians will kind of fall under this Eminus source.
Yeah, it's a lot about your own reputation, what you're able to sort of get from other people in terms of just being a respected person. And as mentioned, Eminus is going to have this kind of arbiters theme. Arbiters are kind of highly disruptive, as well as apply pressure at the same time. Eminus is going to not have a lot of ways to permanently get rid of your opponent's stuff, but be really effective at temporarily removing problems from the board state.
Yeah, so kind of the trade-off there is the classic bounce spell, if people are familiar with this kind of thing in other card games, where you might return something to their hand, or even like flicker something out of play for a little while, where you get this incredibly efficient removal in the short term that, if you win the game or manage to string something together, becomes this really like the most efficient removal spells, but in the long term it might turn into card disadvantage or other problems for you.
Exactly. And aside from arbiters, there's going to be a lot of knights in Eminus. Knights are often somewhat based in using magic, but they're really based on using magic to make your knights more powerful.
Yeah, they're kind of almost a classic tempo strategy. If you want to play like a pure Knights deck, you can obviously play like more Knights Burn or Knights Aggro or something like that. But if you play like the full sort of like Zelor Eminus kind of Knight, it's all about getting your threat on the field and interacting cheaply and efficiently while you get your opponent dead.
And Eminus as well, it is going to be involved in this theme of using weapons with your knights in order to deal damage, as well as this removing of cards temporarily from the board. You can kind of build around that. And I think that's about it for the Eminus themes for set 1.
So moving on to the next source, we have Materia, which is kind of like your physical resources in this world. Materia is your access to food, direct supplies, ores for smithing weapons and other things. It's a sort of very down-to-earth source that covers what you have physical access to build off of.
Yep. And Materia is going to be sort of as well in this theme of using items because they are your physical resources. It is also going to have some of the best removal for cards on the board to be able to efficiently kill your opponent's stuff. Not so much able to direct that at your opponent the way Zeller can, but along with Zeller, it is one of these sources that is very good at just killing things dead. Some other themes that Materia has right now would be scribes, which are from the Old Watch, and you can learn more about the Old Watch in our Old Watch lore video that will be out as well. It also going to have Outlanders in the future, maybe not in set 1, might be a few Outlanders now. And the final theme with Materia is going to be Potential, which is a specific mechanic that we can get more into later, but it creates this kind of Rube Goldberg machine that you're able to do stuff with.
Yeah, there's sort of like a secondary resource of energy is what potential is, and some of your cards might generate it and others might take it. And so if you have cards that are in materia that are generating potential and then others that are absorbing it for like an effect, you kind of get to build your own sort of value over time engine.
And the last theme for materia is going to be this kind of self-damage. Materia is the main source where you're going to be getting vampires, because that is the source of Sorvald, who is the progenitor of all vampires in Atnia. And this is going to be a lot of dealing damage to yourself in order to gain power.
Moving on to the next two sources, we aren't actually sure what we're naming these officially yet, so this video may one day be a historical artifact where you get some of our playtesting names left in. But the next source that we're working on is Martial, which kind of in contrast to Materia, sort of Materia and Martial are the two almost mundane sources. Most of the rest of these often represent like kinds of magic. Like some of them can be mundane. Like for example, Zelor, you might just have a knight who's like fighting with his heart, but you also have like a lot of burn magic in Zelor. Materia and Martial are two sides of the same coin in terms of like more mundane themed sources, and Martial is all about the skills that you have in the world. It's about your talent at combat, or perhaps other kind of like technical skills that you have that can sort of bring to the table. So yeah, it's all about abilities and training, kind of.
Yeah, and Martial is going to be kind of the lowest magic source. It'll still have spells, but a lot of the spells will be more like sort of superhuman acts of strength or skill, rather than this kind of maybe arcane magic or divine magic you might see in other sources.
Yeah, so like for example, a spell card in Martial might be something like Sword Throw that lets you swap a weapon from one of your warriors on the field to another one.
Speaking of warriors, Martial has a bit of a warriors theme with the weapons, as mentioned. It is also part of the Arbiter's theme, where it is going to be mainly using its units to interact with your opponent rather than spells. So a lot of your interaction is going to be based on your units directly fighting your opponent's stuff in different ways. And it is also part of the potential theme, so you are going to be able to have some of that in this source as well. And Martial's last theme is hashing cards and saving them for later to be able to play in subsequent turns, and generally playing cards that you've already stashed away and benefiting from that.
Right. And then finally, the last sort of unnamed source that we have, we're currently calling Old World, because that's exactly what it is. It's about magic from the world before the apocalypse, kind of contrasted with this new wild magic of Arca. Old World is all about history and built up on the old structure of the way things used to work. It's consistent, reliable magic that can be unearthed from the depths, often very powerful things that are old or from times lost.
Yes, and Old World is going to be very based on magic and items, not so much units. It is also one of the better sources at interacting with cards before they can really make a huge impact on the game, but perhaps at a greater cost to you as the person trying to destroy your opponent's stuff. And some of the main themes within Old World, it's the heart of the items theme, as well as has some amount of the cleric's theme, and is also part of this potential theme. And another of Old World's themes in set 1 is going to be drawing cards and benefiting from that. And in Old World, drawing cards is sort of themed around unearthing ancient secrets that you're collecting and able to utilize. So you're going to need to have devotion to your sources in order to play your cards, and the way you're going to get this is through channeling your cards, which is talked about in the first episode of this series. The other main way of achieving source devotion is to play locations. These locations are going to give you a permanent bonus to your source devotion. So whereas channeling cards only lasts for a round, this will be a way of permanently gaining more devotion to a source. Now there are 3 ways to get locations. The first way is through your starting locations. When you are deck building, you will get to choose 3 locations as your starting locations, and you can choose the same one more than once. These are all just single source locations. and you'll begin the game with them in your location zone. So these will give you a head start towards meeting your source requirements, and they will reveal to your opponent before the match starts what sources you're playing to some extent. Now, the starting locations each add 1 to your devotion of a given source, just like channeling a card, and all of the non-starting locations will add 2 devotion to each of their sources when you play them. And this is just because if you were to simply channel the location, you would already be getting 1 devotion, so by playing it out, you get 2. The other 2 ways of getting locations, besides just having your starting locations, are to put location cards directly into your deck, or while playing, you can trade your cards in for single source locations that are a bit worse than the ones that you would put in your deck directly. And this is called exploration, and the way it works is you reveal a card from your hand or channel zone, you put it on the top or bottom of your deck to acquire a single source location of the source of your choice. Now, locations as a whole are going to be sort of a cost that you have to pay. You have to play more locations if you would like to play cards that have a higher devotion to a given source. So you can choose to build your deck in a way where you maybe won't need to play very many of them, or you might build your deck in a way where you really want some high source devotion cards, and so you'll be planning on playing a lot more locations of that source, and maybe that'll push you away from including other sources in your deck. Now, playing a location does have an inherent cost to it, but usually that cost is not an upfront cost of energy, which is the main resource that you spend in order to play your cards. Whether you are exploring for a location or playing one directly, you are essentially giving up on that card until you use that location's one-time ability to draw a card. And this ability is what will cost energy. So you are giving up on a card until at a later point you decide to pay the energy to get it back. And because of how this interacts with the channel system, this also means you're giving up on some amount of card selection because you could be channeling to the bottom to draw new cards.
Yeah, and so that's kind of a great lead into the main sort of philosophy behind this and some of the downstream effects it's going to have when we talk about deck building with these requirements.
Yeah, so the whole philosophy here is that the sources are a soft gate rather than a hard gate on what cards you're able to play in your deck. In a system like Hearthstone or Legends of Runeterra, you essentially pick a class or category of cards, and then you have access to all of the cards from that category. In some ways, this is more similar to Magic's resource system of the colors on your lands, where it's more of a soft gate, where you can include cards of any source in your deck, but your ability to play them is going to be a bit of a game of risk and reward for how much you're willing to invest into that source while you're playing the game, and how much you're willing to invest in that source while deck building. Because the more cards you have of that source, the more you're going to be able to channel for it. And you may want to include locations of that source directly into your deck if you know for sure you're going to be wanting to play locations of that source during the game.
Right, but one of the downsides of locations is that they're kind of a loss of immediate tempo.
Or a cost of card selection, depending on when you pay the energy to get a card back. And if you intend on playing out the full quantity of cards that you get during the game, then you're definitely going to have to be paying that energy at some point.
So unlike Magic, where you're wanting to play a land every single turn, in this system, especially if you're playing an aggressive deck, you may not want to play locations at all and just want to rely on channeling for your source requirements. There's an advantage to playing a lower number of sources and source requirements because it lets you just kind of fire off your cards as you want to without sort of needing to invest in locations.
Yeah, and you definitely won't necessarily want to be playing a predetermined number of locations on each round. It'll be very much based on which cards you are wanting to be playing, and how much devotion you need to play those cards when added together with your channel cards. And the cost of not having a location when you want to play one is not going to be hugely backbreaking. It'll be bad for you, but it'll mostly just mean that you need to give up on a bit more card or tempo advantage, at least temporarily, in order to play the card that you want to play, if you still desire to play that card with that additional cost. And this is because exploration is always an option.
Yeah, and so there are some really interesting kind of downstream effects to this system. The first is that when it comes to the sources, you're basically kind of locked into making a choice between going wide and deep. So it's relatively easy to, if you have Zelor in your deck, pay the source requirements of a card that only has one source requirement in Zelor. You only need one other Zelor card in your hand to cast that, or even your starting location might just already pay for that for you. However, some Zelor cards might cost 4, 5, 6 Source Devotion, which makes them a lot harder to cast unless you have a lot more Zelor cards in your deck. And in that case, it becomes a lot harder to play other sources than Zelor. So you might just want to play Zelor or Zelor plus one other source, for example. However, if you include just only very small costs, you might be able to split your deck across 3, 4, maybe more sources. And so there's that sort of central deck building tension there.
Yep.
So another major downstream effect of this system is how important multi-source cards are. If you're playing a 2-source deck, a card that pitches for both of those sources becomes really valuable for fixing towards all of your requirements, essentially. So you'll want to end up playing a lot of those, and they're both probably going to be very good, powerful cards to play and useful for sort of fixing your sources. But with 7 entire sources in the game, what this means is, assuming that everyone is building 2-source decks, which is not really a reasonable assumption, but just assuming that for now, there are 21 different combinations between pairs of sources. So when you decide that you want to make a deck with source A and source B, for example, perhaps a Zelor Arca deck, you are essentially gaining access to a specific subset of these multi-source cards that are immediately going to color the flavor of your deck, and you're going to want to include some of them because of the importance of sort of meeting these pitching requirements, which is going to do a lot in terms of adding deck diversity under this system.
Exactly, and to go along with this idea of going wide versus going deep, this is something that you don't even really see so much in Magic. You see it a little bit with some situations, but here it's going to be much more a core part of how things function, where there will be cards with very high source requirements, and you will be able to meet them with varying degrees of consistency, depending on whether you're playing 1 source, 2 sources, 3 sources, maybe even 4 sources. And when you narrow down your focus into a smaller number of sources, you're going to be gaining the greater depth of those sources. So you're able to kind of decide exactly what portion of the overall card pool you're going to be pushing yourself towards. And this is interesting because part of what makes deck building work is when you make one decision, that affects which other deck building decisions that you want to make. Including one card may mean that you are more likely or less likely to include another because that card may work better or worse with it. And when you have these kind of hard gates, what can often happen is once you are deciding your overall card pool, because it is the same as any other deck that has chosen that as their gated off card pool, you will be pushed to play often the same packages of cards that are within that card pool. But because you're able to play a much greater variety of combinations here, and whether you're going deep or shallow, our hope is that the packages that you get pushed towards will be different depending on the exact construction of your deck and what cards you're building around.
Right, and so kind of contrasting this with other card games, so as an example, and this isn't to knock on Hearthstone because it functions very well for the type of game that it is, in Hearthstone, in general, in the meta, there's usually 1 or 2 meta decks of any particular class, and you kind of want to lean in to one particular sort of package available within that class package, which leads to a sort of predictable build of any given meta deck. Whereas the level of complexity that's going to be available, especially as this card pool grows deeper and we introduce more sets, means that once you make a couple of initial decisions of, for example, there's this multicolored value card that I really want to play in Arca Ecclesia or something, and start building around it, you'll end up making wildly different deck building decisions. And what we're kind of trying to design towards is this universe where maybe a handful of meta decks sort of surface to the top, as often happens in these card games, but if you're very familiar with the system, you can build sort of things around the meta that are capable of competing with it, leveraging sort of the complexity of the packages allowed, and they're kind of all overlapping packages since every single gate is soft.
Exactly. And so to go along with your hypothetical, to expand on it a bit more, You may pick the same two sources, and you may pick the same two source card value card as another deck, but maybe you are also going very deep into one particular source. So you're going to be focusing your locations and channeling more on that source to get another card that has a high source devotion for that source. And you may be then pushed away from a selection of random other cards that you would otherwise be playing that would be part of those other sources that you aren't going as deep into. And then this might also push you towards using more interaction cards that are deep within the source you chose to go deep into. So this can kind of have a cascading effect on your deck building decisions. And part of why it works like this is once you have, say, 7 devotion to a given source through your locations, you can play as many 7 source requirement cards for that source as you want. So if you're putting one card with a source requirement of 7 materia in your deck, at that point there's very little cost to including more cards with a source requirement of 7 materia in that deck.
Yeah, this plays right back into the gameplay of the game itself, because one of the important resources in this game that goes hand in hand with the pitch system where you have to reveal cards is information. And the more you understand about what your opponent's deck is doing and the choices it's already made, if you're familiar with the card pool, the more you'll be able to sort of deduce about what the other cards that you have yet to see in their deck are and what their overall strategy is.
So I believe that's about it for the sources. And this overall structure around the sources is kind of something that we have really thought about somewhat deeply, and we're hoping that this is going to have these kind of good impacts on deck building, because a lot of what makes these card games interesting to us is being able to build decks in them. And in a lot of other card games, you maybe aren't able to deck build so much anyway because you don't have the in-game digital resources or monetary and paper to have everybody be trying decks willy-nilly, but we're hoping to as well sort of break down those barriers so that anybody is able to try different things and build decks without so much worry about devoting resources into sticking with one deck for a longer period of time.
Yeah, exactly. And sticking with one deck for a longer period of time for people who like it is still going to be a great way to gain experience in the game, and you'll get better at that deck in particular, and also understanding the card pool around that deck and making micro decisions in how you want to build that deck specifically. But there also is just this breadth of possibility of brewing that we really hope to introduce to allow people to experiment and either succeed or fail with all kinds of varieties of decks in this game.
Yep, and I should note that deck building being interesting is not only important for deck building, it is important for the overall experience of the game, because even if you're just playing meta decks that you net deck or whatever, you're still playing against other players and you're still choosing from those meta decks. So if there is a greater variety in what you're playing against and what you have the choices to play, you're more likely to be able to play something that you really enjoy and really vibe with.
Yeah, and I think that just about covers everything we wanted to talk about. I hope this gets you as excited as it's getting us. Really excited to actually have this game out and start playing with everyone.
Join our Discord server, by the way, if you would like to talk to us about any of the projects that we're working on within Atnia and Project Delta. If you know somebody who is interested in doing software, art, graphic design,
playtesting, anyone who knows anything about publishing this kind of thing in paper, anyone who's interested in coming, chatting about the lore, learning about the world itself, yeah, please come.